Hello everyone, it is Friday, and that means it's time for this week's MTG Top 10. This week, we are looking at the top 10 cards in Magic history that make creature tokens. Specifically, we're looking at cards that make creature tokens for the player who casts them, so cards like Beast Within are not under consideration. I have to say, of any list I've done, this one took the most work, as the list began with almost 1,000 cards that I had to eventually pare down to the top 10 that have made the most top 8 appearances at premier events. For every card in this list, I will include the statistics of the card, meaning, how many top 8s it got, and explain as well why it made it into the top 10. I was inspired to make this list by two things, the first of which was last week's leaked Kaladesh spoiler, which was Saheeli's artistry. It's a really cool design. I always love modal cards in general, and it makes tokens. It made me wonder what token-making cards in Magic's history have made the biggest impact on the competitive scene. Additionally, I'm doing some testing for September's Budget MTG, which is my monthly series where I build a deck in Standard or Modern on a budget, and then record matches with it against top-tier decks. And right now, I'm thinking I'll probably choose to record with a Modern Black-White Tokens deck. Those two things combined are what made me want to do some research on tokens. Before we get started on the list, I wanted to mention a few cards that when I decided to do this list, I was sure would end up in the top 10, but this top 10 is so stacked that they didn't actually make it. So these three cards are all incredibly powerful, obviously. They're all cards that have seen a lot of play and they're very strong, and you would have thought they would make it in the top 10, like I thought they would, but they didn't. It turns out that there are a lot of powerful cards that make tokens in Magic, and while Wormcoil Engine and Elspeth Knight Errant have over 40 Premier Event top 8s, and Young Pyromancer has almost 20, those numbers were not actually good enough to make the list. Before we get into the actual top 10, I do have one honorable mention I wanted to discuss briefly, and that is Timely Reinforcements. I wanted to mention this card because in terms of sheer number of top 8s, it actually should have made the list at number 5 or so. However, I made the decision to only include it as an honorable mention because it has almost exclusively been a sideboard card in its appearances. It is an incredible sideboard card against burn decks and aggro decks because it not only gives you an immediate board presence that can protect you, it also gains you life, and this can sometimes be all your deck needs to beat a burn deck or Death Shadow Zoo in Modern. The card made its first top 8 appearance in the standard format of 2011, where it was in the sideboard of the incredibly powerful Caw-Blade deck. It also showed up in the sideboards of basically any white deck during the time it was in Standard, most especially Tempered Steel and Blue-White Delver, and it has done the same in Modern since it rotated out of Standard. It finally broke through above the Grand Prix level in 2011 at Worlds that year, where it appeared in 6 of the top 8 deck lists. It first appeared on a Modern top 8 list in 2012, where it appeared in a Blue-White Tron deck at Grand Prix Lincoln, and now, anytime Burn is a legitimate deck in Modern, Timely Reinforcements makes an appearance. It has even shown up in Legacy sideboard, showing that it is probably one of the best sideboard cards all around in any format. So, of its 64 top 8 appearances at Premier events, it only made the main deck at 4 Grand Prix. So, only 4 of 64 were main deck top 8s, and that's the reason I didn't want to put it on the actual list. But as I said, a sideboard card this powerful still deserves mention. So let's move to our actual top 10. At number 10, I have Bitter Blossom, which made a lot of top 8 appearances as a crucial part of the Fairy deck that dominated both Block and Standard in 2008. After first appearing in Fairies, it was realized the card was so powerful it didn't matter if your deck was a Fairy deck. If you ran Black, you should probably have it. So in addition to Fairies, it began showing up in top 8 decks in Standard like Doran Siege Tower decks and Green-Black Elves decks. It also showed up in the extended format and Life from the Loam decks. It was featured in the Standard Black-White Tokens deck that emerged in 2009 as a powerful deck in Standard, and the Fairy deck also began dominating Standard in 2011, Modern rather, in 2011, making several appearances in top 8, so many that Bitter Blossom was actually banned in the extended format, so I actually mean extended and not Modern. But this banning was actually carried over into the early days of Modern. However, it was eventually unbanned and began making appearances in Modern. It has also been featured in a few Legacy sideboards where it can come in against more controlling opponents. Unfortunately for Bitter Blossom, though, Fairies hasn't been a super competitive deck in Modern for a while, and as a result it hasn't made a top 8 appearance in any format in over a year, and may not get another one anytime soon. At number 9, we have Nyssa Vastwood Seer. However, the Vastwood Seer part of Nyssa doesn't actually make a token, though her Planeswalker side does. Her ability to do so is actually very relevant too, because generally for a Planeswalker to be powerful, she or he needs to be able to protect itself with either a creature token or a removal effect, and Nyssa Sage Animus can do that. The -2 is usually only used once, especially because the creature token is legendary, and then once Nyssa is safe, one usually uses a +1 effect to draw cards. Despite Nyssa only being around for a little over a year, She has made a solid number of top 8 appearances, all in one format in Standard. Most decks with green try to play her because of her ability to search you out of land and subsequently transform into a real threat. She found a lot of success in the Abzan deck so around when she first appeared in Standard, and subsequently appeared in most ramp decks of the format, and has been featured in some decks built around Collected Company as well, since she's one of the few planeswalkers that can actually be hit by Collected Company. Right now, she is also appearing in Teamer Emerge decks and Delirium decks, showing how versatile she is. However, she is rotating quite soon and has never made it into another format, and I don't know if she will be anytime soon. At number 8, we have Wingmate Rock. Along with Siege Rhino, this card helped Abzan mid-range decks dominate for as long as Khans of Tarkir was in Standard. The raid trigger was easy enough, so you could get the creature token almost all the time. Plus, if that wasn't enough, it also gained you a bit of life to help you win a race. So this card managed to appear in 49 top 8s, including 5 Pro Tour top 8s, and it was just a huge card in the format. It was also very expensive because of that. Obviously, Siege Rhino was probably the best creature in the deck, but Wingmate Rock wasn't super far behind that. Paying 5 mana for 6 power in the air that gains you life is kind of ridiculous, and that's why it was so good. At number 7, we have Lingering Souls, a format-defining card when it was in Standard. Most decks just tried to find a way to fit it into their deck, often just splashing black so they could cast it from the graveyard. During this format, if you weren't running a deck with red and green in it to cast Huntmaster of the Fells, you were running a deck that had Lingering Souls crammed into it. The great thing about Lingering Souls is that you can pay 3 mana for 2/1/1 tokens with flying to add to your board immediately, and then you can decide whether you want to save or use your flashback and Lingering Souls immediately. Sometimes it's best to save it because if you're playing against an opponent with board sweepers, it really puts them in an awkward position if you're slowly killing them with your 2/1/1 flyers and you have Lingering Souls in your graveyard. They just don't even want to use their board sweeper because you can just get 2 more tokens. It's just amazing value too. I mean, even if you don't think about it like sort of strategically, 5 mana for 4 power and 4 toughness across 4 bodies on all evasive bodies is pretty amazing card advantage. It made its debut in the Grixis Delver deck at Pro Tour Dark Ascension, which was about as early as it could show up, and it found continued success in the Black-White Tokens deck that was so good in Standard. It also made appearance in winning decks like Esper Stoneblade, Reanimation decks, and the Aristocrats. It showed up in Modern in Gifts and Given decks first, and then in the Abzan decks of 2015. It has picked up a top 8 as recently as June of 2016, so I don't think it's quite done yet in Modern. At number 6, we have Hangar Backwalker. Creatures who put a creature token into play when they die are usually pretty good because of the card advantage they grant you. Well, how about putting a bunch of tokens into play when it dies, and giving those tokens evasion? Yeah, that sounds pretty ridiculous, and that's what Hangar Backwalker does. For the low cost of 2 mana, you can slowly tick this guy up until you want to start attacking with him and giving your opponent terrible choices to make. Your opponent has to choose whether or not they want to block him and kill him and thus give you a bunch of flyers, or just take the damage. He's been a pretty consistent force in Standard since he was printed, showing up in the Blue-Red and Soul Artifact deck at Pro Tour Magic Origins first. After everyone saw how strong the card was, and the fact that Hangar Backwalker was colorless, he began appearing in everything, artifact synergies or not. This included Abzan decks, as well as basically any aggro deck around, and even after Soul Artifact rotated out of Standard, he continued to see some play, but sideboards began to find ways around Hangar Backwalker. There were too many cards that could exile things like Stasis Snare, and things like that. And for a while, Hangar Backwalker disappeared from Standard, and people weren't playing it anymore. Well, eventually, Nyssa, Ally of Zendikar was printed, and Hangar Backwalker became a lot better. And he's a fixture in the Green-White Tokens deck that is one of the best decks in Standard right now. He's also seen a tiny bit of play in Modern and Affinity decks that have made 1 or 2 top 8s. At number 5, we have Huntmaster of the Fells. This is an incredibly powerful creature. It's one I mentioned earlier. I said, basically, you either wanted a deck playing Lingering Souls or Huntmaster of the Fells when Dark Ascension was in Standard, and that's why. They're both 2 very powerful cards. They both made this top 10 list, for example. So with Huntmaster of the Fells for 4 mana, you get a 2/2 Wolf token, the 2/2 Huntmaster himself, and 2 life. Then your opponent also has to deal with the fact that if they don't cast a spell, or if you don't cast a spell, it immediately transforms into a 4/4 Trampler, who also does 2 damage to a creature and the opponent. And then if it transforms back, you get the Wolf token and life gain trigger all over again. So there aren't many Wolves who have a trigger on each side. I actually think this and the new Ulrich are the only 2 that do that. And Huntmaster of the Fells is a lot more powerful than Ulrich. It has two amazing effects, and it can be turned into a token engine in the right conditions. As such, Huntmaster was an absolute monster when he was in Standard, with lots of decks just doing their best to have red and green in them to run what may have been the most powerful creature in Standard at the time. He was in straightforward red-green aggro decks, but also Nio aggro decks, Naya that is, Jund decks, Birthing Pod decks, and Primeval Titan decks. The thing that made him so great is he is good in both aggro decks and control decks and mid-range decks. Huntmaster eventually broke into Modern 2, appearing in Jund decks, which is usually one of the top-tier decks in the format. It looks like he isn't quite done making appearances there either. While he had sort of disappeared from Jund decks for a while, he actually picked up another top 8 at a Modern Grand Prix just last weekend. At number 4, we have Sorin Solemn Visitor. He was pretty much a fixture when he was in Standard, making its first appearance as early as possible with 3 top 8s, including a win at Pro Tour Khans of Tarkir, where it appeared in the powerful Abzan deck alongside the aforementioned Wingmate Rock as well as Siege Rhino. The deck was so dominant that almost all of Sorin's impressive number of top 8s were in that specific deck. Sorin hasn't really broken into any other formats yet, but all he needs is for some sort of token deck to show up. That's where he can really shine, because he can not only make tokens, but he has a nice payoff for if you can go really wide, because he gives all your dudes +1/+0 and lifelink for a whole turn. So that's pretty sweet. He hasn't seen play in Modern yet, but I guess it could happen at some point or another. At number 3, I have Throg Tusk, another very powerful creature. Throg Tusk is all about value. When he comes into play, he gains you life. And when he leaves the battlefield, he leaves a 3/3 beast token behind. He makes spot removal really bad, and he was great in Standard, where he appeared in pod decks and reanimator decks that sought to take advantage of these triggers. He was also good in control decks, since he made it much more difficult for your opponent's creatures to kill you between the 2 bodies and 5 life that he gave you. He even broke into Modern, showing up in 2 different Modern decks that had to get banned out of existence, Bloom Titan and Birthing Pod, and he picked up a top 8 earlier this year in a Modern Chord of Calling toolbox deck. And, he's very good, and you can also abuse him really amazingly, and that's the reason he's in the Chord of Calling deck, if you have Restoration Angel, because you'll notice, unlike most triggers, it doesn't say when he dies, it's when he leaves the battlefield he makes a beast token. And when he enters the battlefield, he gains you 5 life. So if you play Restoration Angel, you gain another 5 life and get another beast token. So it's pretty amazing. And he's probably going to see a little more play in Modern as time goes on. At number 2, I have a card that surprised me a little bit. I knew it was a good card. I knew it had seen a lot of play, but I didn't expect such a recent card to be so high up on the list. But here it is, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar. He hasn't been around all that long and isn't even that close to rotating out of Standard, but he's also put up good enough numbers to be in the number 2 spot on this list. This is because he has shown up in basically any top 8 deck that happens to have white in it since he's been in Standard. Here's a list of just a sampling of the decks he's appeared in top 8s in. Abzan, Jeskai Token, Selesnya, Megamorph, Black-White Control, Hardened Scales, Bant Company, Green-White Tokens, Mono-White Humans, White Weenie, and so on. He's also already seeing some play in Legacy, where he has shown up in sideboards for Death and Taxes and Blue-White Miracles. He probably has several more top 8s left in him before he rotates, and he may eventually even see some play in Modern, and maybe some more play in Legacy sideboards. He's great because he's just so flexible. 4 mana for 4 loyalty. He can tick up to become a 5/5 himself. The most common mode of play, though, is when people put a few Knights into play and then use his Anthem effect. So, again, he's a card that pays off playing tokens. He's seen the most success recently in green-white tokens, alongside Nyssa, Ally of Zendikar, who doesn't make this list either, surprisingly, but that's mostly because she only has appeared in that deck, whereas Gideon has appeared in all sorts of decks. So, at number 1, we do have another Planeswalker, and it is Elspeth, Sun's Champion. So, Elspeth Knight Errant didn't make the list, but Elspeth, Sun's Champion is number 1. Like Gideon, this powerful Planeswalker tried to find her way into basically any standard deck that had white in it, especially the more controlling ones. She was incredible for control decks because she can make 3 human tokens to protect both herself and you, and she could destroy any problematic creatures your opponent had in play, while keeping your tokens alive. She appeared in Orzhov control decks, Esper control decks, Blue-White control, Abzan control, Naya control, Jeskai control, and even some Devotion and Constellation-based decks. She appeared in every single Pro Tour top 8 when she was in Standard, and that's not an easy feat. Since rotating, she has made a few appearances in Modern, including in a Splinter Twin deck that won Grand Prix Pittsburgh in 2015, and in a Blue-White control deck that finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Lille just last weekend. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your favorite card that produces creature tokens in the comments. Also, if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to click the like button. This will help more people see it. And if you aren't already a subscriber and you want to make sure you catch MTG Top 10 every week, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.